Today's video is going to be a breakdown of how I rigged this eye for my client. Although this is only the first pass in terms of rigging, I figured that it might be helpful for a number of people. In addition to tips and tricks that I thought might be helpful, I also included my mindset while doing this. Sometimes hearing other people's situations can help you with your own struggles and challenges. Thanks so much for watching, and if you want to see more, please consider liking and subscribing. Prior to starting this recording, I first started with doing some basic meshing, which you can see on the left side. This whole process took about 2.5 hours, and for everyone's sanity, I decided to speed up the footage. I believe even sped up the footage gives a pretty good idea of what I've been doing. If you need any specific help, feel free to ask. Here I'm using the Deform path tool to put a natural bend to the eyelash line, and just adjusting it as needed so it doesn't look too lumpy. If it looks too lumpy, it's usually because the mesh is not detailed enough. It doesn't have enough vertices to allow for a smoother transition. For this next piece, I utilized the temporary Deform tool. You can find it using the little red button that looks kind of like a deformer on the red bounding box. I highly suggest you explore the other options within the temporary Deform tools, because there's a lot you can do if you just kind of experiment and play around. Here I'm using the Deform brush tool. It's a pretty intuitive way to kind of push things around the way you want it, but sometimes it can be a little bit too heavy, so make sure to play with the settings if necessary. I purposely sped up this part because I end up redoing the eyelash meshes anyway, but I just wanted to show you how they look a little bit blocky when the mesh is not detailed enough. The next is the eyelid. You may notice that there's a little bit of a hole in the art on the right side. You may also notice that when I'm trying to stretch this mesh, it doesn't look so good. So I decide to redo the mesh. I achieved that by isolating the edge of the texture. This is especially effective on flat images with solid colors, because other than the color itself, there isn't any detail that needs to be maintained. So you just need to focus on the outside. Later in the video, you'll see me address the hole in the artwork. I could just re-import it, but that takes a lot of work, so I figured I would just do a little bit of meshing magic, and I fixed it later. Now would be a good time to focus on the parameter part. You'll see I put 2 points of the parameter. Basically, 0 would be the eye closed, and the 1 would be eye open. Right here I have the second point as 1.2 because I plan on having a wide eye effect, and it's just easier and simpler just to keep it like that for now. The upper and lower portion are separated by deformers just to keep things a little bit cleaner. So we did the upper portion, and now it's time for the lower portion. You'll notice that I move the parameter a lot just so I can see the eye open and close, because sometimes it's just the action of doing it that helps you see which parts are missing or out of place. Eventually you may notice that I use more color coordinating on my parts. The reason why I do this is so it's easier for me to tell which parts I've had for which parameters, like which ones are eye open versus physics versus head angles. This is just my personal system that works for me, and I highly encourage you to just play around and see what's comfortable for you. Here I'm creating the eye skin, which is one of the reasons why I have the upper and lower separated. So that way I can have the iris not be affected by this moving skin. And you may notice that it says pupil, and part of that is just a translation issue, but just ignore that for now. Next I create a new deformer called brow, and I put the eye skin and the brow part within it. Here's when I decided that the original meshes for the eyelashes weren't working out. Then I decided to use one of my favorite tools, which is the stroke mesh tool, and I basically just meshed it myself. But with the help of mesh width and repeated density, I'm able to have more control over the overall shape without so much pixel by pixel editing. Vertices that overlapped unnecessarily, I would select them both and then just merge them for easiness sake. I then go about going through and cleaning up the mesh as needed for each keyform. Remember that if the keyform is not green and doesn't have a red circle around it, it's not being recorded the way you think it is. You can right-click the green target keyform and it'll snap to it, keeping it nice and simple. Stroke meshing ends up being one of my favorite tools because I can create a lot of textures consistently and cleanly with minimal effort. The stroke meshing tool is particularly effective when you're using line art and the mirror edit tool, because you can just line up the center vertices along the line that you're trying to follow, and it makes everything very clean and simple. For this next part, I'm going to be using the stroke meshing tool again because there's a lot of manipulation involved for the edge of the eye, the same way you might use for the edge of the face. There's not a lot of contrast between the background and the texture itself. I changed the background color just to make it a little easier for me to see. Here I just wanted to focus on what it looks like when you merge vertices together. It's important that the program sees the mesh as closed, like you're tying your shoelaces or something, and the only way to do that is to kind of get rid of the excess vertices and keep everything nice and clean. If you remember before, I mentioned about how things that are solid colors need very minimal meshing on the inside. And so this sclera has some very gentle gradation on the edges. And so I kept it still simple, but a little bit more to be able to capture that if needed. So now I'm squishing the sclera down for when the eye is closed. And the reason why I'm doing it with the red bounding box instead of using a deform path around the edge and then squishing it down is because it can get really clunky really fast. So this is just my preferred way of doing it. Saying too many cooks spoil the soup, and it's kind of like that. If there's like too many controls, it can get harder to control. So it's about finding that balance. Here I'm fixing that hole that I mentioned, and I am trying to figure out what's the best way to patch it up. So basically I am isolating that hole by itself and creating a little bit of extra space, so then when it does go down, I can kind of just cheat my way over. This is what I would like to refer to as brute forcing it. Sometimes there are elegant solutions to solving problems, but sometimes you just gotta do the thing. Here's where it can get a little complicated. What I'm doing here is double clipping. Live 2D can be very finicky when it comes to clipping. Generally, when you close your eye, you expect the eyepieces to stay within the eye. And then when you turn your head, you're still expecting all the pieces to stay hidden. But that doesn't really work in Live 2D, so you have to do some workarounds like I'm doing here. I won't go through double clipping here, but I'll leave a resource down below, and I'll definitely have more videos on that sort of subject in the future. Now comes one of the more fun parts, which is having effects do cool things. The actual premise of it is pretty simple, and I think that it's really accessible for everyone to be able to do interesting effects with minimal work. A lot of it kind of depends on smart meshing and just imagining what it is that you're trying to accomplish in the first place. Sometimes even while meshing, the background can be a little bit hard to see. So if that's the case and you don't know actually how far the edge goes, I highly suggest checking out the display mode. Sometimes the model image can be more helpful for meshing, particularly if the texture is already very deformed. I found that meshing along straight lines and effects gives it the best way to keep it from warping and looking not the way you want it to. The same process with things like skirts and whatnot, anything that has details where the edge really matters. If you put the mesh along the edge of whatever it is, it allows you to keep the general shape that you're looking for. Auto meshing is often a good starting point, but when it comes to smaller details, I prefer to do it myself because it often will put kind of unnecessary shapes and vertices where it's either not necessary or it ends up creating effects that I don't want. For example, it wouldn't keep the straightness of these little effects that I'm looking for. But part of it is also just because I'm a perfectionist and I like to keep things as clean and compact as possible, so don't necessarily take this as the end-all be-all. That's one of the biggest takeaways with live 2D rigging, is that everyone has a different style and way of doing things. There is no one way of doing things, and in fact even the most experienced people are always learning new ways of trying new things, and that's part of the fun of it. Circles are one of the cool things that you can mesh, just because if you just put a mesh straight in the center, as I start to do before I decide that I want to potentially make this bigger, is that you can create so many different effects, like a spike or a stud or something like that. All it takes is to think about you're putting down this mesh, but you can also think of it as a 3D shape. Here I treated the heart in a similar way. This is a case where I put too much mesh, like it's really not necessary, but at the same time I didn't know exactly what I was doing. So in a lot of cases it really doesn't need to be this detailed, but you know me. When it comes down to it, it just depends on how much control you want to have. The more control you want to have, the more mesh you have. I'm using the mirror edit tool here because it's important that the mesh is symmetrical if I plan on reflecting it. This is true with anything that you want to have reflected where both sides of it you want to be reflected in the same way. For example, if you look left and you want your look right to be exactly the same but in the opposite way, the mesh will have to be symmetrical, otherwise the program won't know which vertices to move in the same way. Now comes to the real fun part, which is applying physics to the different eyepieces. I personally like to put them as blend shapes to allow for the most flexibility. Some of them I'm putting on eye open because I specifically want things to dilate and move when she opens her eyes. But then if I want them to kind of jiggle and shake, that's when they go under physics as a blend shape. It's important that you pay attention to the names and the IDs that you give your parameters, particularly for these parts, because if you decide to replicate a parameter, it will have the same name as the one you just replicated, but it will basically just add a number at the end for the ID. If you have a lot of moving parts, like for eyes or hair, if you don't have a system that you follow, it's going to get confusing very fast. Next is to try it out in physics, and to make sure that the blink is working correctly, we have to first set the eye settings for blinking and lip sync. The program has a set number of default parameters that have very specific behaviors, and so you're basically associating this parameter movement with this behavior. And so things like eye blinking and breathing will always act similarly depending on the input. Like if you're using face tracking, if you blink in real life, whatever you associated with eye blinking in the program, that's what's going to happen. You can see I have a lot of names in here, and so that adds to the importance of making sure you're labeling things correctly so even you can understand what the heck you're doing. When I first come into physics, I like to increase and decrease the output to get it at an even 100, because that will be the best reflection of what the physics should and will actually look like. Much of this footage is sped up because it's mainly just me playing around with numbers, and we won't be talking about physics today, but it's all about what looks right. Just play around until it feels good. Now that I'm satisfied with what I put, I move on to the next parts. The next step is making a parameter for physics. It's important to think about what your minimum, maximum, and default are. For things that are basically just on or off, you would just have it as 0 and 1, and then the default be 0. And then for things that are like bouncy or jiggling and stuff like that, that's when you have -1, 0 for default, and then 1 as the maximum. You may sometimes run into an eye maybe not closing or working the right way. It's always good to double check your minimum maximum range to see if it's actually where it's supposed to be. For example, if you put anything under 0 for eye open, the program is not even going to recognize it and it won't show it. So if you're confused as to like why the eye isn't closing all the way or whatever it is that you're trying to do, just double check those numbers. It can be sometimes useful to isolate specific vertices, like in the last effect I isolated using the lasso tool, and I was able to have more control over a specific part rather than every single part, and that will also reflect on how your meshing is. The stuff that follows is just more of the same. I create a parameter, often a blend shape, and then I go into the physics and I add it as a output setting. And then I sometimes will add more pendulums if I don't want them to happen at the same time and I just want to mix it up. And so a lot of it's just trial and error and playing around, but also just remembering to keep the output at 100 to get the most accurate reflection of what will happen. It's not uncommon for things to look a certain way in the program, and then when you go into real life, they don't seem to act the way you set them to be, which can be frustrating. So those are the types of things to look out for. The following footage is more of the same, so if you'd like to skip forward to the lash animation, feel free to do so. For the lashes, I gave them their own parameter for the upper and then another one for the lower, and then I pretty much edited them very similarly to the effects of the eyes. I decided to take the lash parameters and attach them to the pendulums of the eye physics. It took a few tries to see what would look natural, but in the end I think it worked out. If I really needed to, I could have just created a new group and then made pendulums just for the lashes. Although I can't explain why, I sometimes find that playing with the pendulum order can make a big difference. Like, it's not always going to be 1, 2, 3, sometimes it's 3, 2, 1, or 1, 3, 2. And it's just about what kind of effect you're going for, so just play around. Now we start entering the territory for actually moving the eye within the eyeball. This is where reflect motion will take place. I'm moving the eye to one side, and I want to make sure that the eye moves equally to the other side when looking in that direction. Reflecting vertically is less of an issue, although I do like to do it just to be safe. But it's important because then when you reflect the whole eye to the other side, you prevent your model from having mismatched eyes or a lazy eye. It's definitely an aesthetic. I don't think that most people are looking to do that. Here I'm manipulating the eye skin, so when the eye looks one way, the skin will move accordingly, like it would in real life. I sped up this part because I end up redoing it anyway, but I figured someone might find it useful. Next was to alter the sclera so it would move with the eye skin. We wouldn't really want it to be showing when the eye moves around. Next are the brows. The brows have more parameters than they perhaps need, so I generally keep it to just brow Y and possibly angle, maybe formed. It depends on what the needs of the client are. The important thing here is that I have the brow deformer, which includes the brow part as well as the eye skin, because when the brows move, I want it to move the rest of the eye as well, resulting in a much more realistic movement. Next is adding depth to the eyes. This is often called parallax, and I go a little bit too ham with this one, so I'm going to speed it up. For the parts where I'm redoing it at the end, I'll slow it down so you can actually follow along a little bit easier. The gist with the eyeballs is that I do eyeball X and eyeball Y, and then I synthesize the corners and then adjust as necessary. Finally, I am selecting just the brow for the computer to automatically move, so then I can move the eye myself and have a little bit more control for the preview video. Additionally, here I fix the eye to be a little less pointy and a little bit more natural, and so that's what this process is. I decided that it wasn't very realistic to have the sclera going into the corner of the eye, so that's what I'm adjusting here. And that, my friends, is what got me to this point. There will likely be changes in the future, but for a first pass, I'd say it's pretty good. And I hope that it's been helpful for someone, and if you have any questions, you know where to find me.